Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we continue our Flashback Friday series with a very interesting deal that may have paved the way to a championship for the Milwaukee Bucks. We go back more than 10 years ago and revisit the trade that sent Brandon Jennings to the Pistons and brought the Bucks Brandon Knight and some other guy. We get into all the details after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Into Locked On Bucks, I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen or watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks. It is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just head over to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA, all lowercase, and get a first deposit match up to $100. Camille, week 2 of the Flashback Friday series, and the topic that Bucks fans were most interested in hearing about was the trade that sent Brandon Jennings out of Milwaukee, brought the Bucks Brandon Knight, who was the headliner in that deal, and then some other guy. Well, actually, we should say some other two guys, but one stuck around, and that was Khris Middleton. So obviously, when you hear that Khris Middleton name, it is one of the most impactful trades in recent history for the Bucks and really in team history. When you think about winning a championship as well, I don't think he ever really played the third player acquired by the Bucks in the league. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name because I don't remember him at all. But there was a third player, a forward, that the Bucks acquired from the Pistons for Brandon Jennings. And again, Khris Middleton, the big piece. So we're going to get into all of it, the details surrounding the deal, what brought it to be. But I suppose let's just start in the simplest form here. It was over 10 years ago. It was July 31st, 2013. So we were past free agency, and the Bucks trade Brandon Jennings. I do remember getting the news or seeing it come through as I was working at the radio station producing our nighttime sports show, and seeing, holy cow, Brandon Jennings was traded, because as we mentioned, it's already late July.
Right.
So you're assuming, all right, Brandon Jennings is here to stay. He was a restricted free agent. So that's the details in the story behind why Jennings was traded. Restricted free agent, especially back then, you really didn't go anywhere as a restricted free agent because there was this understanding of, we're not going to put out offer sheets because of how long it got tied up. It's now a couple of days. It used to be, a week or 5 days, I think it was. So you'd be tied up. You couldn't move forward on other deals. So if you're a restricted free agent, you were basically screwed. You were staying with the team that you were going to be on. And that was the story for Brandon Jennings. He had said he was prepared to take the qualifying offer for 1 year and become an unrestricted free agent the following summer. But then July 31st, all of a sudden the Pistons said, you know what, let's just go after him. Let's give him the offer sheet and work out a sign and trade.
Yeah. And we did not think that was even going to happen at that point, because I remember the season prior to the trade where Brandon Jennings kind of hinted a little bit at just not being necessarily the most happy here in Milwaukee. That was the last year that we had the Brandon Jennings, Monte Ellis backcourt. That was the season that spawned Bucks in 6.
Well, hang on. Brandon Jennings, Monte Ellis, and JJ Redick.
Oh, yeah. And that was an offseason of just so much change. And when the Brandon Jennings trade came through, I remember being shocked and being, okay, so we're going to take a step back, because at that time, the best player in that trade was Brandon Jennings. It was just that Brandon Knight was a little bit younger. And then the other two Pistons players that were thrown in were a little bit of salary filler there for the Bucks as well, to make sure that trade worked out. But just thinking about the Brandon Jennings era in Milwaukee and the high hopes that were really put on his shoulder, because that rookie year, the double nickel game just coming out, seventh game of your NBA career, dropping 55 points against Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors. A lot of high hopes were starting to be placed on Brandon Jennings' shoulder. And then what we saw thereafter, I'm never necessarily lived up to that. Like, Brandon Jennings was a volume scorer. Like, he was a gunner. He loved going for his shot going. And when it was falling, it was beautiful. But like you mentioned, that summer, restricted free agency, Bucks weren't trying to pay him necessarily. And then here come the Pistons. And at the last moment, where before that, we didn't think any teams were really seriously going to entertain trading for Brandon Jennings. And then here come the Pistons. They worked that trade out. And like I mentioned, it's so funny looking back and seeing that, like, hey, Khris Middleton and I forget the other guy's name you mentioned. I won't try to pronounce it myself. It was for salary. Like, that was John Horst and John Hammond. They had some recollections on it when I was doing some research going back. And it was funny because John Hammond at the time said, like, he had a specific profile that he targeted when he was looking at players, wanted long athletic players who could defend multiple positions. So Middleton being a throw-in made a lot of sense, especially given the salary, but also the player type that he was.
Vyacheslav Kravtsov was the third player in that acquired by the Bucks in that trade with the Pistons. A couple of things that you mentioned that I want to hit on. The last part, though, the Khris Middleton component, when you talk about his length, I mean, we talked about this a little bit on the Khris Middleton player report card show, but it's easy to forget that he was a very good defender early in his time here in Milwaukee. He was a two-way player, wasn't quite the walking bucket that he has become. He wasn't a bad offensive player, but he was a very good two-way player, and you really thought about the defense of Khris Middleton. And again, no surprise, as you mentioned, with a John Hammond constructed team, you have that. Brandon Knight, who was also a player that was more known for his defense than his playmaking and his scoring, a little bit longer as well, and what Brandon Knight would eventually become, as we'll get to in just a moment here. But that's, the interesting piece around this is we spend so much time with this deal talking about, well, that's the trade that got the Bucks Khris Middleton. And it looks like a bad trade for the Pistons, especially when you look at all of the tree branches of that deal, as we'll get to, and what Brandon Knight became in Brandon Jennings, and then what Brandon Jennings became and all the way down. But we can't go any further without getting a little bit into the Brandon Jennings era in Milwaukee. And you mentioned the double nickel game. He was the 10th overall pick in the 2009 NBA draft. I remember being fascinated by him in that draft, going through the process. Part of it was because, as I think I've talked about on the show, and if you follow me on social media, I root for the Arizona Wildcats. Brandon Jennings had committed to Arizona and then eventually pulled out. Whether or not he had the academics for it was a different story, but he was the guy that we thought was going to start the trend of playing internationally and getting paid to play rather than going to college. So there was that allure that was surrounding Brandon Jennings as well. And you knew he was talented. He was undersized, obviously, but you knew he had that ability to score. And I think when you look back at it, it ultimately came to fruition for the Bucks 4 years later. But that was the type of move that I had long advocated the Bucks to make, in that, look, just roll the dice, right? Go for somebody with a higher ceiling, maybe lower floor, because you're Milwaukee. You're not going to be a free agency hotbed. You got to nail it with one of these draft picks. And that was the thought of Brandon Jennings, was going into that draft, hey, this guy's definitely a lottery pick. If he went to college, if he was showcased more, maybe he's even a top 5 pick. So in some ways you felt like, hey, we got a bargain here.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. We made the playoffs his first year here, didn't make it the next 2 years, but then made it the fourth year with Brandon Jennings in Milwaukee. Like, I remember just the spark and energy that Brandon Jennings brought to the city itself, being in Milwaukee during that time. I was in college during those Brandon Jennings days. So I remember like being around like downtown, and you would see him out and about, and it's like, oh, look, it's our young Buck, the license plate saying young
He's a
Buck.
big call their own club guy too.
Yes. So like, he brought a lot of energy to the city. He had some injuries there, like with the foot and things like that. But for the most part, he was pretty healthy during his time here. And he just had that confidence, that swagger to him, that you were just like, I could really see how this fits Milwaukee. It had that swagger, that aspect to it. And I enjoyed the Brandon Jennings era. Like that's really when I started to come back around and lean into my fandom of the Milwaukee Bucks, because after that 0-1 run and then the trades of Ray Allen, everything like that, for me, I was like, come on, Bucks. Like they took a back seat for me to the Packers in primary. And then, like I mentioned, in college, want something to do. It was really cheap to go to Bucks games when I was in college during that time. So I would go to a game and sit lower level for like $15, $20 and have a good time. And I fell in love with the Bucks during those Brandon Jennings times. So seeing the Bucks take a swing for that Monte Ellis trade and trying to see if that backcourt could work leading up to this summer where they make this Brandon Jennings trade, which, like I mentioned, was a summer of a lot of change. Like the summer that the Bucks acquired Brandon Knight, they lost Jennings, of course. They had lost JJ Redick. They lost Luke Baamute. Ish Smith was gone. Luke Ridnour was gone. Gary Neal was gone. Monte Ellis was gone. Like it was Mike Dunleavy Jr. was gone. They did the amnesty clause on Drew Gooden. Like it was just a complete roster turnover at that point. And that's also the summer they drafted Giannis. So it was just a whole lot of new things happening. Larry Sanders was the guy at that time for the Bucks. Like what a time. And Brandon Knight was coming in just a little bit younger, someone who might be a little bit more defensive focused, who might be able to fit a little bit better with what the Bucks were trying to accomplish, meanwhile not having to pay what it would have cost to keep Brandon Jennings in town.
Yeah, it was, I mean, that's obviously the biggest piece of it was that summer kicked off a lot of change for the Bucks. The drafting of Giannis is the huge piece there, but just how much that roster turned over. And one of the things you mentioned too, I think is important to point out because, you know, for so many years before Brandon Jennings arrived, the Bucks were not a very good team. They were constantly fighting for the 8th seed to get into the playoffs. It was not a given that the Bucks are going to be a postseason team. So to get there 2 out of 4 years during his tenure in Milwaukee says something. It's not entirely because of Brandon Jennings, but he did feel like he kind of ushered in maybe excitement, but more enthusiasm for the team. Now it started to wane, but it was a nice injection of that this franchise was sorely lacking. And Brandon Jennings was a big piece of that for the Bucks. The 55-point game is obviously what he will forever be remembered for. And again, to think that came just 7 games into his career. I remember his first ever game. It was either Halloween or right before that when he was on the road in Philly and he almost recorded a triple-double. And then I think he had a 30-point game just before the 55-point game where it started to feel like, okay, everything that I had mentioned previously, if this guy has a pretty high upside and maybe you're going to roll the dice and really get something here. That first month of Brandon Jennings' tenure, it felt like, yep, the Bucks definitely got something. Mm-hmm. And the other crazy part of it is when you look back at that rookie class, I mean, a couple of things. If you want to feel really old, the person that finished 5th in Rookie of the Year voting in that same class, Taj Gibson, who was 24 years old at that point, but he was a rookie the same season as Brandon Jennings. I remember having the discussion of Brandon Jennings needs to be the Rookie of the Year when you think about what he is doing on a nightly basis and for a team that's making the playoffs in the Bucks. You remember who won it that year?
The 09? No, because Blake sat out that year. Who won it that year?
So it was not Steph Curry, who was also a rookie. Steph finished 2nd. It was Tyreke Evans of the Sacramento Kings who won the Rookie of the Year award. And that was the big discussion is, hey, man, the Kings aren't even making the playoffs. This should go to Brandon Jennings in the 55-point game and the Bucks in the playoffs, albeit is not a great seed. But, yeah, it makes you feel old to revisit some of those names of a rookie Taj Gibson and Tyreke Evans as the Rookie of the Year. But that's where we were with the Bucks and in the NBA.
Yeah, Tyreke Evans. I remember him being a little bucket back then. Like I forgot that he won Rookie of the Year that year because that's the year Blake Griffin went first, but he didn't play his whole first year. So I was like, oh, what's the big deal with Blake Griffin? So, man, it's crazy to think back of what the NBA landscape was like. And we mentioned this before we even went on the air. But just looking at some of the numbers that guys were signing for, and it's like, oh, we couldn't afford to give Brandon Jennings, $12 million a year. And it's like, really 12 million a year? But you have to remember where the salary cap was at that time as well, where you're like, that was a large part of the cap back then. Like that was some big money for a guy like Brandon Jennings. So life changes quickly. But looking back at some of those names definitely brings back some memories.
We've talked quite a bit about the young buck, Brandon Jennings. So the other Brandon that was a part of that trade, we'll get into his career, a short-lived time in Milwaukee, the reasons why, what he brought the Bucks in return, and a little bit more on that other guy that was included in the deal as well. We'll get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. This episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks. They are America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. They're the easiest and the most exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players, because all you have to do is pick more than or less than on 2 or more player stat categories, and from there, watch the winnings roll in. You can win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 with basketball, hockey, and basketball entries on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. They have something for every fan out there. We mentioned all of the different leagues, legends, and everything in between. Caitlin Clark, you can get in on WNBA action. Connor McDavid with the NHL playoffs going on as we speak, or Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, and anybody else, Anthony Edwards, in the NBA playoffs. So all you have to do is download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So the other Brandon in the trade, Brandon Knight. And one of the other things you and I were talking about before we started recording was I had completely forgot, and just looking through some of the numbers for Brandon Knight throughout his career, and you see, oh, that's right, he played in 21-22 season with the Dallas Mavericks, only 5 games. Injuries were really the story of the especially the back half of his career, but he had a number of leg and knee issues that really cut his career short, even though I mentioned he played up until 2022. But when you look at Brandon Knight, it's interesting because, number one, the Bucks worked him out, 2-3 years ago, with a thought of he was going to be making a comeback. And again, he ultimately did that in 5 games with the Dallas Mavericks, but the Bucks were one of those teams that brought him in for a workout. That was the tough piece when we mentioned the injuries that he faced throughout his career. Did not play at all in the 17-18 season because of that knee injury. The following season, he just played in 39 games. The season after that, the 19-20 season, he only played in 25 games. Did not play in the 2021 season because of more injuries. And then just 5 games that he played for Dallas in that 21-22 season. So it was really injuries, and it was almost immediately after the Bucks had traded him. He played 63 games total that season that he split between the Bucks and the Suns. The next season, 52 games. The season after that, 54 games, and only 5 of those as a starter for a guy that just signed. Now it seems like nothing, but at the time, a pretty big contract extension.
Yeah, it was so interesting going back. I tried to look to see if I could find any of my old tweets around the Brandon Knight trade when he came to Milwaukee, because I have been on Twitter far longer than I actually want to say live on air. And I did find one tweet from the Brandon Knight, Brandon Jennings trade initially. And I just said a 3-year, $25 million contract for Brandon Jennings is not that bad. We couldn't work out a way to keep that for ourselves, ? Like that's all that it was going to take. But then I had a conversation with somebody on Twitter talking about how the Pistons have a few promising guards, and if we can get Knight back or Stuckey, who I forgot all about, they're like, that could be a really good return for us. And just looking back and thinking about when Brandon Knight got here, and like I mentioned, how much just changeover that team had that particular year. He came to Milwaukee, and it was okay. Like he had some potential there, but it was really that second year here in Milwaukee where you really started seeing Brandon Knight putting it together. Like, I remember having arguments with people like, I think Brandon Knight's an all-star this year. I remember that Bucks team really starting to pick up steam as well, because that was also Jason Kidd's first year in Milwaukee, Brandon Knight's second year here with the team, if I remember correctly. I believe Larry Drew was there the first year with him, and then was Jason Kidd. So I'm like, this team has the pieces, and, Jabari Parker, and this and that. And we looked this up before we went live, but right before the Bucks ended up trading Brandon Knight eventually, after a year and a half, a year and a half here in Milwaukee, the Bucks were 30-23 at that time, and they had just won 10 of their last 12. Like, it really felt like things were coming together with Brandon Knight. And I remember being upset when the Bucks traded Brandon Knight just a year and a half after acquiring him for Michael Carter-Williams, because I was becoming that attached to Brandon Knight, the point guard, and seeing his growth and just seeing how that team was starting to gel and connect, because Brandon Knight was the best player on the Bucks at that time.
He was, and he was at his peak, in his prime. He was everything we've been saying this franchise needs for the last couple of years. That he was had a little more length to him as a point guard who was he was around 6'3", something like that, but had some long arms, and he was known for his defense. I think ultimately the knocks on him were he played point guard. He didn't have a consistent shot, so he couldn't really be a combo guard in that aspect, but he wasn't great in terms of his playmaking and protecting the basketball. And that became a major issue with Pistons fans, but it was his defense that he was known for. And you saw it in bunches with the Bucks. But I think, to your point, he was the best player on the team, and he was at least arguably the best player at the time of the trade. It I think caught a lot of Bucks fans by surprise. It really was about a year in the making that the Bucks were kind of sniffing around Michael Carter-Williams, and they didn't have the assets for him. That the 76ers, go figure, under Sam Hinkie, wanted draft picks for a player that they had just taken very early in the draft, and the Bucks did not have first-round picks to offer. They had Brandon Knight, but it was very similar to other trades that we've seen happen. You think about why am I blanking on Damian Lillard? Damian Lillard and Drew Holiday, where you think about these other trades that are facilitated by other teams. That's what the Bucks are able to do. Okay, well, Phoenix is interested in Brandon Knight, and Phoenix has this draft pick that they will give you. You give us Michael Carter-Williams. So that's how it came to be. But it was really late the season before the Bucks traded Brandon Knight that the reports started to surface. Hey, the 76ers, don't be surprised if they're shopping Michael Carter-Williams. And that's when the Bucks started kicking the tires on that. As I mentioned, I think it caught a lot of Bucks fans by surprise, especially given the way he was playing and the talk through the years too of, man, this guy could be an all-star through that year, not the years. But it really came down to money for the reason why the Bucks decided to move on from him, because you mentioned that contract that he was in line for, and it was about $12 or $13 million a year that he ultimately got from the Phoenix Suns in that extension. But the Bucks were not looking to pay that money to Brandon Knight. They had that other guy that they got in the same trade, in Khris Middleton, that I believe they gave the exact same, if not close to the dollar and year figure to, in Khris Middleton, that Brandon Knight ultimately got from the Phoenix Suns.
Yeah, that summer when they traded Brandon Knight, that July, they re-signed Khris Middleton to a 5-year, $70 million contract with a player option in the 5th year. So it really did come down in part like, okay, we can't pay, we don't want to pay both of these guys, but we do want to make sure that we lock in Khris Middleton, which in retrospect, that was the right decision for the franchise to make. Like, we can look back and see that now, given the role that he had in the finals run for this team, and just given who Khris Middleton has turned into for the Milwaukee Bucks, which we will get into for sure. But before we move on to Khris, I did find some other tweets from the day where the Bucks traded Brandon Knight to Phoenix. There was a tweet from Mark Stein, of course, just saying that there was a potential 3-way deal in place for Phoenix to acquire Brandon Knight from Milwaukee before the deadline. I just tweeted no, and just all caps, no. Like, what in the world can Michael Carter-Williams do better than Brandon Knight at this point besides pass and rebound? We've lost our closer, which in retrospect, again, rereading this is like, okay, Brandon Knight was the closer for this team. And the only hope that I had, I was like, well, Brandon Knight was starting to thrive with Jason Kidd. Maybe MCW can do the same, given the fact he's a bigger guard, sees the floor. Like, maybe that's more of a Jason Kidd type of point guard. As we've learned recently through Michael Carter-Williams' piece in the Players Tribune, was not a great marriage between coach and player with MCW and Jason Kidd. But yeah, the Brandon Knight time was special that particular year. Even the team itself, they were shocked when the trade went down because it happened like right after they finished practicing. And they, I think, had a game that night or like the next day. And the team itself was just kind of like, what is, like, we lost our leader in the locker room, and how do we move on from this?
Yeah, I was just going to point out everything around that deal. So it came down right after practice ended. That's when Brandon Knight finds out he's traded in that three-way deal to the Phoenix Suns. The Bucks were 30-23 at the time of the trade. As we had mentioned, they had been playing really well, and Brandon Knight was arguably their best player at that time. They were on a win streak. I think they had won 8 of their last 10 games too, where they were starting to play really well. And they went 11-18 the rest of the way and finished the season 41-41, playing the Bulls in the first round of the series that is really only remembered for Giannis body checking Mike Dunleavy Jr. So, and really in the season after that as well, they just really struggled to find their footing. There was a lot of inconsistency. As reading some old stories from the time, Charles Gardner writing a piece about it. The next time the Suns were in town, he caught up with Brandon Knight, who had openly told Charles, yeah, I think about it a lot, and I wonder what might have been, because we were on our way to the playoffs. That's where I wanted to be. I loved it there. I felt like we were all clicking, and I just kind of had the rug pulled out from under me at that moment. I mentioned they went 11-18 to close the season. This was late in the next season. The Bucks had gone 41-62 since making that trade, sending Brandon Knight to Phoenix. So they never really found that consistency. And I think the trade goes in different directions for a couple of teams, for a couple of both the Bucks and the Phoenix Suns afterwards, that I do want to get into in our next segment here. But just looking at everything that came from the Bucks, you mentioned the change, well, late in Brandon Knight's tenure with Jason Kidd, but it really goes back to 2013 when we talk about the change with this group. That was the start of it. The Brandon Jennings trade that brings you Khris Middleton. A little bit later on, you get an ownership change. A little bit later on, you get Jason Kidd. Then you get John Horst in town. Then eventually you get Mike Budenholzer, and this team is off and running. So all of those changes, the tentacles of what is now this era of Bucks basketball, it really centered around this trade that sent Brandon Jennings to the Detroit Pistons. So we'll get into essentially where they are now and what happened for both of those teams after that deal coming up in our final segment here on Locked On Bucks. Well, if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, it is time to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed for you every day, bringing you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Camille, let's, I suppose, start with the Pistons and putting a bow on what happened with them. And I saw a number of fan sites for the Pistons looking back at this trade as well and ranking it one of the 3 worst trades in franchise history, I think largely because of what Khris Middleton became. But I did see a few of those fans and writers point out, not only the Khris Middleton component that I don't think the Pistons necessarily knew what they had in him either, but also it felt like that's when Detroit kind of lost their way and never really found it since then. We mentioned what they did in that summer, very active, that they had brought back Chauncey Billups, and the thought was he's going to mentor Brandon Knight. Eventually, it became Brandon Jennings that he was going to mentor, but their big splash was Josh Smith, which I think they're still paying for to this day. So it was a disastrous summer for the Detroit Pistons. The Brandon Jennings era didn't go too well in Detroit. And again, as we talk about Brandon Knight with some of the issues that he had, Brandon Jennings himself, injuries became a big storyline to him in his time with the Pistons. It was an Achilles injury that really kind of never, he was never the same after that injury. Eventually he gets traded after just 2.5 years, I think, in Detroit, gets traded to the Magic for Tobias Harris. And I think that trade pro Pistons, as Tobias Harris started to put up some numbers and become a pretty good player. We would get to different conversations years later when some Bucks fans would claim he's better than Khris Middleton. But from there, it becomes even more disastrous because Tobias Harris is the player the Pistons traded for Blake Griffin.
Yep. And the Blake Griffin era had some highlights to it. Like, it's just, again, injuries struck. And then things weren't the same. But before the Brandon Jennings trade out of Detroit and before the Achilles, he was playing really well before he tore his Achilles. I remember thinking like, oh, maybe he's starting to hit his stride with the Pistons. And I was really sad when he tore his Achilles because we know what Achilles injuries tend to mean, especially at that time. So Jennings was playing well after, like you mentioned, after the Achilles injury. He did not look the same. And even thinking about decisions that Detroit made, to your point about them bringing in Josh Smith that particular summer, and they already had Greg Monroe and Andre Drummond, and they were like, Josh Smith can be the 3. And that was like a very interesting decision for the Pistons to try to roll out there. But because they did that, it really did push Khris Middleton down in their depth chart, which helped him become more expendable to the Pistons. Because in addition to the Josh Smith signing, they also had Kyle Singler ahead of him. They had a forward from Italy that had just came over as well. So it's like Khris Middleton himself even mentioned in retrospect later on that he wasn't necessarily really surprised when that trade came because he was looking at the depth chart himself and like, I'm like the 4th small forward on this roster right now. Like I might not be here too much longer. And he wasn't. He came to Milwaukee, and ever since then it's just been a beautiful pairing here in Milwaukee. So for the Pistons, like you mentioned, they really never got back on track. I don't want to say it was because of that trade, but that was just another trade that compounded upon just bad decisions for the organization and just rosters that didn't quite ever gel the way that the Pistons thought they could or should. And then thinking about the Bucks side of things, as we mentioned, the Michael Carter Williams trade coming in. And the most vivid memory I have of MCW coming into town and that losing streak was the Bucks playing against the Heat, almost losing that game too. But Khris Middleton had that game-winning shot. They got them the victory, and I remember the team celebrating like they won the playoff game. Like they were going crazy. They needed that win in the worst way, and it was one for Khris Middleton where it's like you got a game winner under your belt now. Like keep going from that moment. And boy, did Khris continue to grow from that moment.
I mean, just all of you mentioned a lot of them, but all of the players that played essentially the same position on the roster at the time that Khris Middleton was there in Detroit. Rodney Stuckey was up there, basically the same size. I know he was viewed as a 2-guard, but not too different from Khris. Kyle Singler, you mentioned Tayshaun Prince. Corey Maggette was a member of that team. Jonas Jerebko, Austin Day out of Gonzaga. Charlie V was on that team as well. So he was completely buried on that depth chart in Detroit. For MCW, the bright spots, not quite as much as you just mentioned there. I think really the big areas, the big highlights that you would look at were that game against the Miami Heat where he was okay. He had some moments during the Bucks run where they were starting to become a little bit of something as well. But really the most memorable one is the 24-1 game where he played fairly well in that game. I think really MCW, look, he was a flawed player, but I think part of it, which did not help him, is in a different circumstance, Could he have extended his career a little bit longer? Probably. And no surprise, we saw him eventually make his way to Orlando with John Hammond. But when you look at the team he was a part of, Michael Carter-Williams couldn't shoot. So you had him out there for his defense. I think at times his playmaking was overrated by a lot of us because he was flashy, but shooting was the issue. So spacing was imperative. And this was a Bucks team that was playing Giannis. And sure, you had Khris Middleton, but Giannis, Greg Monroe, Jabari Parker, Michael Carter-Williams, there's just no space out there. So that was the other big issue for MCW there, which, it ultimately did not become what we had envisioned. But I think at the time there was a lot of disappointment. And, even from Bucks fans, you look back at that trade and think, man, just as I mentioned with Brandon Knight, what would have happened if we wouldn't have made that trade, sending out Brandon Knight and bringing in Michael Carter-Williams? What would have happened if we would have went into the playoffs with Brandon Knight? But, I mean, look, MCW eventually brings you Tony Snell, and as we mentioned, saves you that money that you Brandon Knight trade that you didn't pay to Brandon Knight, and instead you paid to Khris Middleton.
Yeah, and listen, because the Bucks got Khris Middleton and everything that he has become for the franchise in itself, like this is one of
overwhelmingly win the trade.
Yeah, for sure, and just one of the better trades that the Bucks have made. Like we've talked a lot about Khris Middleton and everything that he brings to the table for the Milwaukee Bucks, and he's consistently done it for the last 10 plus years now. Like he is a franchise cornerstone at this part, somebody whose number is going to be hanging up in the rafters, someone who I think even deserves a statue at some point for the franchise. So this was a great topic to look back on. I'm happy the fans picked this one because just thinking back to that time period of Brandon Knight for Brandon Jennings and thinking the Pistons got the best player in this trade and what can Brandon Knight turn into, and then seeing this guy thrown in here. Well, two guys thrown in, but one becoming a franchise cornerstone, like I mentioned, somebody who really also was pushing Giannis, somebody who in practice is the two of them going at it and battling and really trying to take each other's spot, really to start off before that synergy made. But I do think that those battles the two of them had against each other helped so much, not only for their game, but their bond and how they respect one another as well. And as we saw, the respect for those two has blossomed into just becoming one of the best duos that the Milwaukee Bucks has seen.
It's probably unfair to call Khris Middleton a throw-in in that trade because, as we mentioned, there were some things that you could clearly identify that John Hammond, yes, I understand why John Hammond would be interested in this, but again, by no means the centerpiece and had zero attention. If you go back and find any of the stories written up on that trade from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. I think Jim Ozarski was with On Milwaukee at the time covering that. You look at any of these stories and it's Brandon Knight, a paragraph or two on Brandon Knight, and then the next line, the Bucks also acquire Khris Middleton, who played in 18 games and scored 4 points per game, something like that. That was it. And to look back at that and think, again, what you eventually turn Brandon Knight into, MCW, he becomes Tony Snell and so on. But you also get this guy that is going to finish number 2 in just about every single offensive category and then some in franchise history. An incredible deal for the Bucks. And as we mentioned a number of times in this show, this whole era, it really traces back to that summer in 2013, where that's where everything started to shift towards what we see now.
Yeah, and just one last thought, and it has nothing to do with the trade itself, but that summer of 2013 with drafting Giannis. Shout out to Nate Walters. I was a big Nate Walters. Nader's gonna Nate. It was something about Nate. I was like, man, we got us a point guard right here. But yeah, that summer really that's a special summer for me, and just thinking of Bucks history and things of that sort. Like not only the on-court product and thinking of what that becomes, but like on a personal level, that was the same year I met my husband. and we bonded over the Bucks. And like we would go out to bars, like, can you guys turn the Bucks game on? And they're like, why?
Are you kidding me?
Like,
right.
why? So going from those days of why do we want the Bucks game on in our bar right now to you can't go out during the Bucks game and not see them on multiple TVs, seeing how big this team, world champions in 2021, one of the greatest NBA players of all time, suiting up for the team with Giannis, like thinking of that summer in 2013, all the turnover, thinking about how bad that first year was, winning 15 games to getting to where they are now. Like it's been a ride.
It really is fascinating when you look at that roster from the 12-13 season and you think of all the names that were not there the following year. You mentioned all the big ones there, but so many names that you're just reminded of as well. Beno Udre, who is now the coach of the Bucks G League affiliate, was a member of the team that year. Second tour of duty for the Vanilla Gorilla, Joel Prisbilla, on the team. John Henson was a rookie. Ursan still in his first tour of duty with the Bucks. Samuel Dalembert and his run
trade
with the Bucks. Yeah. So it was really a fascinating time in Bucks franchise history. And it became even more fascinating starting with this trade, even though a big piece of it would still take years. But the same summer, you get Khris Middleton and Giannis Antetokounmpo. That is where this turnaround really started to get its roots for the Bucks. Fun to revisit this one. We're going to have a new poll out there later on here for you guys to vote on for next week's Flashback Friday episode. We put together a list of probably 20 to 25 topics to cover here. And some of them, as you've seen, we've recycled of, okay, decent amount of votes. Let's throw it out there again and see if people are interested in, just as we did with this trade. But look, if you have suggestions as well, maybe there's something that is not on that list of 25 or so that Camille and I put together. Leave those on the YouTube page as well, or tweet them to Camille and I, and we'll certainly take those into account because, you know, this is obviously revisiting some interesting moments or years or teams or players in franchise history, but it's also for you guys and what you guys are interested in hearing. So let us know what you want to hear from next on the poll question. But even if there's something not listed on that poll that you want us to dig into and cover, we'll get into that because we got a lot of time, Camille, with still, 4 months of no Bucks basketball, 4+ months. So a lot of time to get into these flashback episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So please, you guys, let us know if there's any topics that you want to hear for. And also in the comments, just leave your memories as well from the trade. As like, I didn't know if I would be able to find some of my old tweets. So seeing those were really funny. And if you guys have any memories from the Brandon Jennings trade or just that era and that time, drop them in the comments. I will definitely be in there responding. This is nostalgia in a different way where it's like, oh yeah, this is now it's over that 10-year mark when all of this has happened. So like it is nostalgia at this point. So we definitely want to hear from you all about your memories from this trade as well.
We will have another Flashback Friday episode 1 week from today. Still working on an interview for next week. And I think, I don't want to promise it, but I think we're going to get at least the first view of Frank's free agency primer and his thoughts for the offseason at some point next week as well. So still a whole lot that we have coming up here on the show, even though there is no Bucks basketball. For Camille, I'm Justin. Thanks for tuning in once again. We'll talk to you next time on Locked On Bucks.